Monday, December 4th. Mom and I had to leave a half hour earlier today in order to be at Tangerine Middle School by 7:30. I packed my bags and my lunch like I was going for a normal day. What did I know? Mom drove tensely, silently, angrily. I can't say that I blame her. In just 1 week, both of her sons had gone from success to failure, from public praise to public shame. I tried to picture Mum in our climate-controlled storage place, finding the gym bag, not recognizing it, wondering whose it was, deciding to open it to find out, staring at the items inside, pulling them out one by one, the awful truth appearing to her gradually, like a slowly developing Polaroid. We pulled up in front of Tangerine Middle at 7:25. Absolutely nothing was happening. None of the karate kickers were on the sidewalk, none of the gangsters were hanging out, none of the buses were pulling into the loop. I'd never been there so early before. We walked through the front doors and climbed the stairs to the main office. Dr. Johnson was just inside the glass doors talking to two other adults, Thomas Cruz and a woman I recognized from the soccer games. She looked a little like Victor, so I guessed she must be Mrs. Guzman. Dr. Johnson shook hands with my mother very seriously. She looked at me and said, "Paul, why don't you wait out in the hallway for a few minutes? We'll call you." Dr. Johnson led the adults to her inner office. I drifted back through the glass doors into the hall. I heard light footsteps on the stairs, so I started watching the second-floor landing. A familiar brown ponytail appeared, then a familiar face. I said, "Teresa, hi." She didn't really look at me. She came to the top of the stairs and said, "So there you are." I said, "Did they call you in too?" "No, not me. Just Tino and Victor. They're inside." "They are? I didn't see them." "Yeah, they're in there. Dr. Johnson probably put them in the nurse's room. That's where they usually wait." "Oh. Why are you here?" "Me? I'm always here early. For my job." "Office aide?" "Yeah, right. That's me." Teresa and I stood together with our backs to the glass wall of the office. We stood for a whole minute like that, in silence, like two strangers waiting for a bus. Then I remembered, and I reached into my backpack. I pulled out the science report, laser printed in 4 colors with a clear plastic binder. I handed it to Teresa. "Here, I was hoping I would run into you. I finished putting together the report. I hope you like it." Teresa took it and studied the title, printed in tall orange letters with black shading. She read it out loud. "The Golden Dawn Tangerine." She leafed through the report, looking at the pie chart for the varieties of citrus grown in Tangerine County, and the bar graph for the decline of citrus acreage in Tangerine County. She whispered, "This is beautiful. This is an A+ for sure." Teresa looked me in the eye and smiled, but not for long. Suddenly, like they had sprung a leak, her eyes filled up with big tears that rolled down her cheeks. She shook her head from side to side and demanded to know, "Why did you do this?" "What? Do what?" "All of it." She held up the report. "All of this, all of it. Why did you come to my school and come to my house to work and jump on some coach? Are you crazy? You messed up your whole life. Do you know that?" I had never seen Teresa angry or upset. Now she was both. I tried to calm her down, but she went on, "Listen, you're not one of those guys. Do you understand that? You're not one of those guys who's sitting in the office all the time waiting to get punished. You don't even belong here. You don't live in Tangerine. You live in Lake Windsor Downs, and you're going to have to keep on living there. You're going to have to go to that high school. You're going to have to face that coach and everybody else who was in that gym. Tino and Victor don't have to do any of that. Tino and Victor are going to walk away from all of this." She looked away, shaking her head at my absolute stupidity. She took several deep breaths, then she looked back at me and repeated calmly, "So why did you do it? Why did you jump on that coach?" I raised my shoulders up and let them fall. I've thought about that a lot over the last 3 days. I spent a lot of time thinking about stuff, probably too much, but that night in the gym, I didn't think at all. I just did it. Teresa wiped her cheek on her sleeve. "Yeah? Well, you really messed up. Tino and Victor got caught anyway. They always do." We fell silent again and settled back into our positions against the wall. I tried to lighten the mood. I said, maybe this is all your fault. You're the first one I met here. You're the one who took me around." She didn't know if I was kidding or not. She said, "So how's that make it my fault?" "You introduced me to Tino and Victor." "Yeah, well, you said you wanted to play soccer." "But you didn't have to do that. You could have let me sink or swim on my own." Now she smiled, slightly. "Yeah, I could have let you sink." She pointed to the office. "Dr. Johnson told us that some kids were coming here from Lake Windsor because their school fell down a sinkhole. I don't know, I guess I figured you'd all be looking down your noses at us, and some of the kids were, but not you. You acted like you were happy to be here. You liked it here. Then you said you wanted to play on the soccer team. I don't know, I guess I felt sorry for you, especially when I thought about what Victor and those guys might do to you." The door to Dr. Johnson's office opened. Teresa and I both looked in that direction. She said, "Whenever Louis talked about you, he called you Paul. I'm going to start calling you that too." She took me by the arm. "Come on, Paul." She led me into the office. Dr. Johnson walked out and said, "Teresa, would you go ask Miss Pollard to come up here and to bring Paul Fisher's file with her?" Teresa gave me a silent squeeze on the arm and took off to do the errand. I peered into the inner office. I could see Mum's profile. She was crying. Dr. Johnson said, "Okay, Paul, come with me. You can wait in the nurse's room. We'll be calling you boys in one at a time." She led me down the short hall and opened the door to the nurse's room. Tino and Victor were sitting in there, sitting in black chairs against the white wall. They seemed smaller, younger than I remembered, like little kids. They certainly weren't nervous. I guess they'd been in here too many times. Tino continued to stare straight ahead, but Victor popped up in his seat and started in on Dr. Johnson. "Oh, no, Dr. Johnson! You're bringing the wrong boy in here now. Fisher, though, man, was just sitting up there with his mama and papa. He just fell out of those bleachers like he fainted or something. He's lucky he landed on that dude. That broke his fall." He turned to Tino for support. "Fisherman fainted there in the grove last week. Am I right?" Tino ignored him. "Dr. Johnson, he might have a brain tumor making him faint like that. That boy needs an X-ray." Dr. Johnson shook her head and said quietly, "Things are bad enough, Victor. Don't make them worse. Now come along with me." Victor opened his eyes wide and looked at me. Then he got up and followed Dr. Johnson out of the room. I sat down in his chair next to Tino. He surprised me by speaking right away. "When you get in there, don't be running your mouth like that fool Victor. All you say to Dr. Johnson is 'yes, ma'am,' 'no, ma'am,' and 'thank you, ma'am.' Understand? You take your 3-week suspension and you go home." I said, 3 weeks? You figure that's what it'll be?" "Yeah." Tino shifted around in his chair, but he still wasn't looking at me. He went on, "And you can tell Tuna for me that we weren't disrespecting his brother or anything like that. We just had to take care of business." "I think he knows that." "Yeah, well, you tell him I said so." "Okay." Suddenly, Dr. Johnson opened the door and signaled that it was Tino's turn to follow her. I was left in the nurse's room by myself, staring at an eye chart. It seemed like it was about 2 minutes later when she came for me. I followed her into the inner office. Mom was sitting in the same spot. Her eyes were red, but she was no longer crying. Dr. Johnson stood behind her desk, held up a thin white booklet called the Student Code, and said, "I've already explained this to your mother, Paul. The school board has set down its policies in this booklet, and we are all obliged to follow them. It is my duty to explain to you what violation you committed and what penalty you will receive." She held the booklet out in case I wanted to read it. She explained, "Your violation is called a Level 4 infraction, in this case, assaulting a teacher or other school board employee. This is the most serious level of infraction. The penalty for this and any other Level 4 infraction is expulsion." Dr. Johnson paused to make sure I understood. I don't think I did. I was thinking to myself, 3 weeks. I'm supposed to get 3 weeks. She continued, "As of today, you are expelled from all Tangerine County public schools for the remainder of this academic year." She paused again and looked at me. I heard myself say, "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Johnson set down the school code booklet and asked, "Do you have any questions about this?" I thought of "no, ma'am," and "thank you, ma'am," but I couldn't say them. I was too confused. And I did have questions. I said, "What about Victor and Tino? Are they expelled too?" Dr. Johnson frowned. I could tell that she didn't want to talk about them. She pointed back at the student code and said, "No, Paul. Their violation falls under the level 3 infractions, fighting with another student. The penalty for that is 3 weeks suspension." I nodded. What else could I say but, "Thank you, ma'am." Dr. Johnson moved toward the door, so Mum got to her feet. Dr. Johnson said, "Your mother has decided to waive your right to appeal. Basically, Paul, you did it, you got caught, and you got punished. On the positive side, you have already completed enough days to get credit for this semester. There are options available to you. Your mother has selected the option of enrolling you in a private school to complete the second half of 7th grade. We were all moving out the door by now, into the main office. Other kids were coming in and out. Dr. Johnson held out her hand, and I shook it. She said, "I wish you well in that option, Paul. Goodbye, Mrs. Fisher." And she was gone. Just like that. I guess I had expected more. I guess I had expected a pep talk or a stern speech, but she got rid of me as quickly as she had gotten rid of Victor and Tino. The office was starting to fill up with kids, and Dr. Johnson was needed elsewhere. The day had begun. The students at Tangerine Middle School were doing what they always did, but I was not among them. I was no longer one of them. That realization hit me suddenly, like a smack in the face. I followed Mom down 2 flights of stairs, keeping my head lowered so that I wouldn't have to look at anybody. When we got to the front door, I could hear the sounds of the mob of kids outside. The karate kickers had arrived. So had the gangsters. They were all doing what they did every morning, being wild, being loud, until they saw me. Then, in a heartbeat, it all stopped. They all stopped what they were doing to stare at me. Mom and I stood at the top step and stared back at them. She said, "Paul, what do they want?" I could hear mumbling from different areas in the crowd. They were saying stuff like, "That's him," and "That's Fisher." One of the biggest and the baddest 8th grade gangsters moved toward us with his boys right behind him. Mum let out a frightened noise and whispered, "What are they doing?" I turned toward her and said out of the corner of my mouth, "No fear, Mum. Show them no fear." I walked slowly down the steps. Mom stayed where she was. The mob parted slightly, just enough to swallow me up. That big 8th grader held his fist out, and I put mine down on top of it. He said, "All right, Fisher." Suddenly, they were all on top of me. All these guys I didn't really know. Guys who didn't really know me. They started pounding me on the back, rubbing my hair, shaking both of my hands at once. They were all saying stuff like, "Way to be, Fisher. Hang tough. Keep your head up, man." It was a strange moment for me among these big, bad strangers. Their words surrounded me and picked me up and moved me along toward the car. I could hear Mom yelling over the top of them, "Paul, are you all right in there?" Mom had worked her way around to the driver's side door and was fumbling with the keys. I opened my door and turned back to the mob. I couldn't think of a thing to say, so I just stuck my thumb up in the air awkwardly and slipped into my seat. They all turned and headed back to the usual places. Mum quickly locked the doors, and we peeled out. By now, she was more puzzled than scared. She waited until we were safely away to ask, "What was that? What was that all about?" I curled my lip. "They know a bad dude when they see one, Mom." "Paul, you are not a bad dude." "Oh, no?" I jerked my thumb back toward the mob. "Do you see any of those wusses getting expelled? From every public school in Tangerine County?" Mom breathed a loud sigh. "You'd think those would be the worst words a mother could hear." She shook her head back and forth. I didn't know if she was going to laugh or cry. She laughed. "Not in this family."